Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'm here to speak to you and introduce Dr. Joe Glatthaar and his talk as a part of our campaign series on the Vicksburg Campaign, which was conducted in February of 1995. When General Grant moved south, the brilliance of his military acumen really wasn't realized at the time. Grant had a bad reputation in the old army. He was rumored to be a drunk. He, in fact, had resigned his commission in California, had returned home, and then had failed in several efforts to succeed in private life. So down on his luck was he that he was widely regarded to be a failed drunkard who was not highly sought after when the Union went to war and it started looking for experienced officers to command regiments that were being put together. Grant was in his late 30s, and he was not somebody that everybody knew and said, "Where's Grant? We must bring him back to the Army for this great opportunity." Instead, he realized his duty, realized that his heart belonged in the Army, especially with the country going to war. And so he went to Ohio and offered his sword to the governor of Ohio, which was not accepted. Ultimately, he gets a commission as a colonel and slowly advances through the ranks, shows some potential while he's in southern Indiana, in Illinois, and along the Ohio River and into Kentucky. He has success in the captures of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, and plays a key role in General Buell's capture and occupation of Nashville, the first Confederate state capital to fall. He then runs awry of his boss, Henry Halleck, who becomes jealous of Grant's success because Grant is subsequently promoted to Major General, the same rank that Halleck has, although Halleck is certainly senior to him in dates of rank. And because of what happens around Nashville, Halleck lets rumor pass that Grant has fallen into his old habits again, meaning that he is a drunkard and can't be trusted. And so he's tabled before Shiloh. After the Battle of Shiloh, in which he barely escapes with his reputation after scapegoating men like Lew Wallace and protecting friends like Kump Sherman, Halleck is promoted after the Corinth campaign and goes to Washington to become the commander-in-chief of the Union armies, replacing George McClellan. And U.S. Grant is given the opportunity to command in the West, to basically be the man in charge of the operations against the Mississippi. This particular lecture shows an element that is perhaps Grant's best side. It is his ability to work collaboratively with people. He does scapegoat people. There's absolutely no question that he ruins reputations and ruins careers. He doesn't like William Stark Rosecrans. Read Dr. Barney's book on that. He does not like Lew Wallace and makes Wallace the scapegoat for Shiloh. Grant's always looking for a scapegoat when things don't go exactly right, and he's very protective of the people that he perceives to be his best friends. In this instance, though, what you get to see in this lecture is how Grant is able to understand the synthesis and the need for various groups of people and commanders to be able to work together for a common objective. In Partners in Command, Dr. Joe Glatthaar recognizes this, and what is particularly interesting is in this case, we now deal with Grant dealing not only with a subordinate officer, William Tecumseh Sherman, but also with a naval officer, a man of some ego and talent, David Dixon Porter, and how Grant works with those two officers throughout the campaign to achieve his ultimate goal, which is to reopen the Mississippi River for commerce. Joe Glatthaar, at the time of this lecture, was still stationed and working at the University of Houston as a professor in their Department of History, and his works very nicely suited some of our early products, and having been well satisfied with the work and the presentation he had done in Richmond, I was anxious to invite him back. And this is the first of 2 lectures that he gave in this particular campaign study. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Joe Glatthaar.
I gather you don't have any problems hearing me. I'll try and keep it down so that we don't disrupt the other room. David Dixon Porter was dining with a quartermaster on a vessel when a staff member came down and announced that a visitor had arrived. And so the quartermaster went upstairs, came down. This shabby-looking fellow with some brown slacks and a gray coat covered with dust entered the cabin, and he was introduced as Admiral Porter, meet General Grant. That was the first exposure that Porter had with Ulysses S. Grant. The two of them then moved to a side table, and Grant declined food and everything. He had just ridden horseback for numerous hours to get there. And in the course of about 10 or 15 minutes, Grant laid out his plan for Porter, what he wanted to do. This is in November of 1862. And the plan was to capture Vicksburg. And he told them what he was going to do was advance along the railroad to the south and draw the Confederates out from the Vicksburg garrison. And then Sherman would land over in the Haynes Bluff area, storm the bluffs, and come in and occupy the railroad and push on into the city. And what he wanted was Porter's assistance, using his gunboats as artillery to support the landing, and of course as a convoy to bring the transports in. The meeting took just a few minutes. Prior to this gathering, Porter had very little confidence in Army personnel. He was very much predisposed against them, and that's the reality of the situation. Just a few weeks earlier, he had said, quote, "I don't trust the Army." This is what he wrote to the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. "It is very evident that Grant is going to try and take Vicksburg without us, but he can't do it." Well, prior to that meeting, Porter had examined some of Grant's previous campaigns, and he was actually quite impressed, especially with the Forts Henry and Donelson affair. And he was also impressed that Grant exhibited what he called, quote-unquote, a bulldog tenacity. But on the other hand, he had a great distrust for all Army personnel because there was a strong Army-Navy rivalry at the time in those days, much stronger than we would find even today. And so Porter was genuinely prejudged or predisposed to dislike Grant, but what he found was all impressive. After discussing the plan, Grant just got back on his horse and rode back out, taking no food, taking no drink, and that was the end of their initial gathering. As far as Grant and his key subordinate, William Tecumseh Sherman, were concerned, they couldn't have done better than David Dixon Porter. Porter was born the son of a famous Navy admiral, or Navy commander. His father had been a hero in the War of 1812, and as a young man, Porter got involved in naval affairs. At 13, he took his first military voyage. By 16, he had joined the Mexican Navy and was at war against Spain. He was captured and imprisoned in Cuba for 6 months, and he virtually starved to death there. And that probably inhibited his physical growth considerably. After the war, he came back to rejoin the U.S. Navy and rose in rank, although the rise was rather slow. In those days, of course, the Navy was even more stagnant than the Army with regard to promotions. And so Porter held the rank of lieutenant for 20 consecutive years. That's an amazing thing. Then, just prior to the war, he got a few assignments that generated considerable publicity for him. He had to mark courses through treacherous Hell's Gate in New York and also through Buttermilk Channel. And because those were New York City harbor channels, that generated enormous amounts of publicity, newspaper coverage, and so on. So Porter was actually a pretty well-known Navy officer, if there were any in America at the time. Right before the war broke out, he received an exceedingly lucrative offer from a private shipping company to come in and work for them. And Porter was mulling that over when the war broke out. Very early on, Porter got involved in an affair with Pensacola, Florida, and retention of the fort there. He also supported his it's hard to call him, foster brother is probably the correct terminology, David Farragut. Farragut was adopted by Porter's father, and he supported Farragut in the endeavor to New Orleans. In fact, it was Porter who developed the gunboats on rafts and actually conceptualized the whole project. He was only 5 feet 6 inches tall, so he wasn't a very big man. He actually wasn't very thick either. He had a really long black curly beard. He had black hair, which he used to sort of paste down, slick down hair. He had dark brown eyes, a sharp nose. He had a very high-pitched voice, and that sort of made him a peculiar individual. But on the other hand, he had this really keen mind, and he had a very quick tongue. And as a result, he sort of compensated for that high-pitched voice with the witticisms. He also had a photographic memory. He was an exceedingly bright, exceedingly intelligent individual. He grasped issues almost instantly. But that was a negative because the Navy was so overwhelmed with tradition, so stultifying in its advancement, that he was very intolerant of people who weren't as quick as he was, or who weren't as progressive in their thinking as he was. And so what happened in his world was he just infuriated all sorts of people. One could say that he occupied the seat of honor at the naval doghouse because he was always in trouble, just always in trouble. And it's really an unfortunate thing because here's a man who's really farsighted, who's really aggressive, and who really wants to do wonderful things, but the system doesn't permit him to do so. Now, he's got negative qualities. He has a tendency to exaggerate. He doesn't suffer fools very well, and he can become exceedingly sarcastic. Lincoln called Porter, quote-unquote, a busy schemer and underestimated his ability throughout the course of the war. Secretary of War Stanton considered him, quote, a gas bag who makes a great fuss and claims credit that belongs to others, which some people might have considered an autobiographical statement of Stanton rather than a description of Porter, but that gets us neither here nor there. The reality is that he was a busy schemer and that he was a gas bag, but he was a guy who could back up what he said with performance. The most influential individual in Porter's life was his father, David Porter. As I said before, he was a hero, a national hero in the War of 1812. In the War of 1812, we produced a number of very prominent seamen. Oliver Hazard Perry is one, Stephen Decatur is another. A third is David Porter. These people accomplished extraordinary feats with very limited resources, and so his father was virtually a household name, something tantamount to what you would think of as far as, say, Norman Schwarzkopf or something like that. Unfortunately, his father gave his son a number of qualities, including the inability to bite his tongue. His father had gotten in an argument with some congressmen, and he was eventually brought up on charges and convicted in a court-martial, suspended from rank for 6 months, and fined. So he sat out for 6 months, and as soon as he was brought back on active duty, he resigned from the United States Navy. That had an enormous impact on his son, David Dixon Porter. His son went out to destroy what he called, quote-unquote, the old fogies who would persecute his father, and the system that permitted that sort of thing to take place. Well, shortly after the Grant Porter meeting, Grant contacted Sherman, had Sherman come visit him, and they hammered out the plan. But as far as Porter was concerned, he hadn't met Sherman. They had corresponded, but they had yet to meet. In fact, for over a month, the two of them had been writing back and forth, and they had established quite a harmonious tone between them. In mid-November, Porter had advised Sherman that Grant ought to use his gunboats in any attack on Vicksburg. Quote, "I wish to cooperate with the Army in every way where I can be of service, and if you can get any message to or from General Grant on the subject and give me an idea of what is going on, I shall be much obliged to you." Sherman responded by sending him all sorts of maps and all sorts of other information, and also calling for a unity of command. My opinion is that a perfect concert of action should exist between all the forces of the United States operating down the valley. And I apprehend some difficulty may arise from the fact that you control the river, Curtis, that's Samuel Curtis, on the west bank, and Grant on the east bank. Sherman's already wrestling with the issue of joint operations and a unified command. He's a very far-sighted individual. Were either one of you in absolute command, all, of course, would act in concert. To this, Porter agreed. "I am ready to cooperate with anybody and everybody," the Admiral wrote, "and all I ask on the part of the military commanders is their full confidence and a pull together." Thus, when Porter first went to visit Sherman, he expected the very best of circumstances, and the reality was something far different. What happened was, Porter arrived and met Sherman's staff and was seated, and they said that the general will be with you momentarily. Well, no one told Sherman that Porter was there, so for an hour, Porter sat there in a chair in Sherman's waiting room, and Sherman didn't appear. Well, finally, Sherman came out, and there was Porter. And Porter was about to explode. He was livid. So Sherman invited him in, apologized, said, "No one's told me," and then Sherman said, "Excuse me for a second, I had to clean up a few other little matters," which took him a few seconds. Well, that was about the last straw. Porter is not a very tolerant man to begin with, and he was not going to endure this from Sherman. And so he just was on the verge of exploding, and then Sherman turned back to him and started talking to him. And he began engaging Porter, and Porter was fascinated with the guy. And then Sherman was over poking at the fire and doing this and doing that, but all the time talking about what they intended to do, the steps he had taken to prepare for this event, the steps he planned to take. And Porter was overwhelmed by this guy. He was genuinely impressed with Sherman. And within the course of a few minutes, the two of them just bonded magnificently, just as Porter had anticipated. So the relationship between Sherman and Porter, while it got off to a rough start in person, it quickly fell into line beautifully, just as had the Grant-Porter episode. Well, on December 19th, Sherman's troops climbed aboard transports, headed down towards Vicksburg. They picked up another division at Helena, Arkansas, and joined with Porter's fleet, which guided them up the Yazoo River, and there they made their landing. What they hadn't found out, of course, was that some cavalry units had severed Grant's supply line when he was pushing to the south, and so Grant, on his drive, never got anywhere. And what Sherman was going to do, of course, was storm the bluffs at Chickasaw, bluffs, and then swing around, seize control of the Vicksburg and Jackson Railroad there, and drive on into, technically I guess it's, and drive on into Vicksburg, hoping, of course, that Grant would have lured the garrison out. Well, of course, Grant wasn't able to accomplish that because they had two converging forces from such great distance. They hadn't coordinated activity very effectively. And the consequence was Sherman's troops landed and charged up those slip bluffs. They had had a lot of rain, the Confederates were really well fortified, and Sherman's troops were slaughtered. It was a really horrible affair. And that night, after the attack, there was a torrential rain pour. The next day, Sherman and Porter got together to try and hammer out the situation, determine what they were going to do next. And they decided that Sherman would fake an attack, and Porter would take some 10,000 troops, push upriver some miles, and then try and assault there. But unfortunately, that night, a huge fog rolled in, and so that scratched the whole episode. The entire affair was a terrible nightmare for Sherman. 1,200 Federals were killed or wounded, and another 550 were captured by the Confederates, which is a rather substantial loss, especially if you're one of those 1,200, and let alone the 550. Nevertheless, Porter was impressed with Sherman's professionalism. The attack had failed, but he had great confidence in Sherman. Quote, General Sherman is quite equal to the emergency, he insisted to the Secretary of Navy, and nothing daunted by his want of success. Several days after the failure at Chickasaw Bluffs, Major General John McClernand came down the river. Now, McClernand outranked Sherman, and so it was a bad situation there, because Porter had developed considerable confidence in Sherman and had very little confidence in McClernand. He had known McClernand in Washington and called him, quote unquote, a hybrid general. In other words, a guy whose career really wasn't military, was really being a politician, but he suddenly became a military commander because that was the ticket to becoming maybe president of the United States or to enhancing his political career. Well, Sherman proposed to McClernand that they take an expedition upriver and go after Arkansas Post. He felt sorry, I keep moving around. I'm accustomed to teaching my class, walking around the classroom, and I forgot I was on camera. Anyway, the Sherman proposed that they go after Arkansas Post. During the course of the campaign here, Confederates came out of Arkansas Post on a vessel and seized control of a steamer which pulled a number of barges that included ammunition and foodstuffs. And so they realized that they were going to have a long-term campaign. They were going to have to knock out Arkansas Post. So Sherman explained the concept to McClernand, but he had explained the concept to Porter a couple of days earlier. Well, McClernand was very hesitant to do it, and Sherman said, Porter, when he comes down here, you talk him into it, because he'll listen to you. As it turned out, when they came to visit Porter, McClernand claimed that this was his idea and laid out the map. So Porter had greatly distrusted McClernand in advance. Now he decided he really hated the man. So the only way he would agree to go along with it, because his ships were vital to the whole process, was if Sherman was in command of the combat forces. In other words, McClernand would command the overall expedition, but the troops on the ground, Sherman was going to command. As it turned out, they chugged up to Arkansas Post, and Porter's bombardment essentially defeated the Confederates. There was a Union infantry assault, but they were licked, no doubt about it, by the naval bombardment. But in the aftermath of the fighting, McClernand took all credit for the victory. And Porter, of course, was furious. He sent a message to the Navy Department. I find that Army officers are not willing to give the Navy credit, even in very small matters they are entitled to. He was absolutely disgusted with the whole affair with regard to McClernand. Well, when Grant finally linked up with these two commands, Porter had had his fill of the man, and so he was not in the least hesitant to express his opinions to Grant. Although he didn't know Grant very well personally, this was Porter's style. Sherman, of course, he said to Grant, was just an outstanding officer. In fact, he wrote to numerous people how much he admired Sherman and how little he admired McClernand. He considered Sherman, quote unquote, every inch a soldier and has the confidence of his men. McClernand is no soldier and has the confidence of no one unless it may be 2 or 3 of his staff. Since McClernand's arrival, Grant went on, or Porter went on to say, I have twice the work to do now that I had before. Sherman used to help me to think, but now I have to think for McClernand and myself. That's a pretty deep cut, in my opinion. Sherman, as well, talked to his friend Grant and said McClernand wanted to cut it, and so they both issued their pleas for Grant to assume command of the campaign. Grant readily agreed, and so Grant took over the entire enterprise. For the next 2 months, Grant tried a variety of schemes to get at Vicksburg. Vicksburg, of course, as you are well aware from the tours and from the previous lectures, is a very tough nut to crack when you consider the high bluffs and the river and also the swampy areas all around. It's a very difficult situation. And so Grant tried a variety of enterprises. The canal on the opposite side of the river, which failed when the Confederates maneuvered their cannon to a point so that they could control the whole canal. And then he tried something on the west bank of the river, or on the west side of the river, through some circuitous routes to go all the way down through Lake Providence, and eventually on a 500-mile course they get to the Red River. And he tried another one called Moon Lake, where he would sever the bayou, sever the levee up across from Helena Ark and so on, flood the waters, and then take a circuitous route all the way in to try and get to the upper Yazoo. Unfortunately, what happened there was the Confederates had constructed a fort, and Porter sent 2 gunboats to bomb the fort out, but they weren't successful in doing it, so that issue was a failure. And then the 4th attempt by Sherman, which is actually the wildest and most interesting, is one involving Deer Creek. And it's a pretty roundabout course that they have to use to get there. You have to enter Steele's Bayou from the Mississippi River, which is not far from Milliken's Bend. And then you have to travel to Black Bayou, to Deer Creek, to Rolling Fork, to Big Sunflower River, and finally to the Yazoo River. So you can imagine how tough that is. In addition, what you've got are huge trees growing over the waterways, and sometimes the water is incredibly narrow, sometimes just a couple of, maybe a dozen yards wide, literally. You know, this room's width, maybe less, and you're trying to run gunboats through those things with trees overgrown. It's a real nightmare. But Porter did so, and he was maneuvering his way through, and Sherman was following on foot with some troops. Eventually, when they were getting near to the breakthrough point on Deer Creek, getting near to where Rolling Fork comes in, the Confederates started opposing it. They began chopping trees down behind Porter and trees in front of Porter. Now, Porter's gunboats are pretty tough vehicles, and so they were able to crash through and pull out stumps and so on as they were going. But with all these trees dropping down, it became a real problem. In addition, some of the trees that were knocked down were weeping willow trees. And if you've ever encountered those, they're a real problem getting. You can imagine what a horrible problem that would be with gunboats. The situation reached a critical point. Porter realized he was in dire straits. He might lose all his gunboats. And so he took a piece of tissue paper and jotted down a note, which he gave to a black man, and told him to go back and give this to Sherman. And it said to Sherman that I'm in desperate need. Get your infantry up here immediately. Well, the freedman got back to Sherman and gave him the note. Meanwhile, Porter didn't know if help was going to arrive, and Confederates began firing at his troops, taking pot shots from the bushes and woods and so on. So Porter began lobbing mortar shells anywhere he could, and that wasn't enough. So that night, he holed up, closed all his portholes, had all his men go below deck, and they tried to wait out the night. In addition, Porter began drawing up plans for the destruction of his fleet because he didn't know if he'd be able to get out of this, and he figured the best thing he could do is to destroy all his gunboats. So the situation was obviously really critical. Sherman got the report and pushed forward the troops he had on hand, and shortly thereafter some transports arrived, and Sherman led those troops personally. All night long they marched through the muck, led by candlelight, so that they could find their course. And then the next day the sun rose and Porter couldn't hear anything, and so he was still really sweating it out. They'd gotten virtually no sleep the night before. And then a couple hours into the day, they began to hear some distant gunfire. And a short time after that, some riders rode up, and they were from Sherman's army. Then about 90 minutes after that, Sherman came up. He was riding a donkey. And of course, it's typical Sherman-Porter conversation. Hello, Porter. What did you get into such an ugly scrape for? Sherman, of course, talks incessantly, doesn't give an individual a chance to respond to any of his questions. So much for you Navy fellows getting out of your element. Better send for the soldiers always. Porter started laughing, of course, taking the ribbon because he was so happy to be rescued. And he responded, I never knew what helpless things ironclads could become when they got in a ditch and had no soldiers about. Then he went on to describe to Sherman how impressed he was with his soldiers, calling them half horse, half alligator with a touch of snapping turtle, which of course delighted Sherman to no end. The Deer Creek experience would have left a sour taste in anybody's mouth, and it certainly must have left a sour taste in Porter's mouth. But it didn't discourage Porter with regard to Grant and Sherman. He still had enormous confidence in them, especially Sherman, of course, who rescued him, but also in Grant. The reality was that for Porter, exposure to officers like Grant and Sherman or exposure to individuals of that caliber transformed his opinion of professionally trained Army officers. Earlier in the war, he confessed to the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, who was an old friend of his, quote, I don't believe in our generals any more than I do in our old fogies of the Navy, unquote. You see, inter-service mistrust and rivalry and early war experiences soured Porter's assessment of high-ranking Army personnel. In fact, I didn't tell you this earlier on, but Porter got dry docked for a while because he made bad comments about McClellan. He thought McClellan was foolish not to capture Norfolk and told McClellan so, and then of course McClellan didn't do so, and it cost him all sorts of problems at a later date, including the revival of the Merrimack fighting as the Virginia. And so when he made some comments about that, he got back to Washington officials, and so he was in the doghouse. Anyway, Grant and Sherman won Porter over through their professional conduct, sensitivity to Porter's rank and position, which was really important. They treated Porter like an individual of comparable rank. They didn't treat him as a member of an inferior service, and that's something that Navy personnel greatly resented. And as a result of these things, they established a really refreshing atmosphere. Well, Grant and Sherman are on board almost every day, the Admiral noted with pleasure in early March. Dine and tea with me often. We agree in everything, and they are disposed to do everything for us they can. That is an incredibly refreshing thought for any Navy officer. More than anything, Porter feared, quote, for the sake of the Union, that nothing may occur to make a change here. What Porter was terrified was that Grant was struggling to get at Vicksburg, and that authorities in Washington would become intolerant and remove Grant, because then he'd get stuck with somebody whom he wouldn't know, couldn't trust, and they'd have to start from scratch all again. And that was a real nightmare for Porter. Now, Porter, of course, liked Grant. Grant was a very likable guy in that he was a quiet man, soft-spoken, and he also had a way about him from a military standpoint which appealed to Porter. That is, Grant was a very aggressive general, very focused, and also willing to attempt unconventional means to get at the enemy. Those are all qualities that Porter shared. And so the two of them really found ground upon which they could function. In contrast with most Army generals, Grant grasped the possibilities of joint operations, and that was unusual. McClellan did, but McClellan utilized the Navy to a very limited degree. I think Grant had exposure with regard to the Forts Henry and Donelson campaign, but with Vicksburg, he really took advantage of what the Navy had to offer, and that pleased Porter enormously. Grant, of course, was rather selfless. That was another enormously appealing quality. Sherman has quite an ego. Porter has an enormous ego. Grant had an ego, but he was able to keep it in check. And so you didn't get that sense. You didn't have a clash of two huge egos or three huge egos in this situation. And most importantly, as I said before, Grant treated Porter like a peer. And that's something that Navy officers seldom got treated like. By contrast, Sherman and Porter established a much more personal relationship. Grant and Porter, while it was personal, Grant's a very shy man. He's a very quiet man. He's hard to get to know. Grant has very few friends. There are very few people who dislike Grant, but he doesn't have very many intimate friends. Sherman is much more gregarious, and frankly, Sherman and Porter are very much alike. In many respects, they're sort of soulmates. They're both quick-tongued, energetic types, extremely intelligent, wholly devoted to their profession. By that I mean that Sherman and Porter have a fascination with military words. It just absorbs their every waking moment, whereas with Grant, it's a job. It just needs to be done. Grant functions on a more instinctive basis, whereas Sherman and Porter are much more cerebral. They're really into the study of the military art, and so they can bring those different issues together. They like to tell jokes, they tease one another, they can damn the world of politics together. So Sherman and Porter just blend magnificently. They establish a truly rich chemistry. Sherman also has a great appreciation for the Navy. In the 1840s, he sailed, during the Mexican War, he sailed out to California and had a fascination with the water. And so what Sherman would do is he'd go on the gunboats and start asking questions. He's so fabulously interested in anything to do with the military that the Navy officers were really impressed, because Sherman would go on these vessels, start asking them questions, how the ship works, what this does, and because that's Sherman's nature. And so what Sherman could do was participate in their world, and that really made these Navy officers feel wonderful. Sherman also had a relentless pursuit of the mastery of the art of war, which appealed to Porter enormously. Porter was a Navy officer who spent years, I don't know if you know much about the pre-Civil War Navy, but most of the time he spent charting channels and doing things like that. And so that's what Porter did. And so Sherman had this fascination with maps and geographic features. So in a strange way, that's a comparable situation. One's doing it below water, the other's doing it above water, but it's the same concept. And so they could share those sorts of things. Porter possessed a photographic memory for written word. Sherman had what seemed to be a photographic memory for topography. And Porter was always really impressed with that. The general himself, this is what Porter wrote with a little bit of an exaggeration, but just a slight exaggeration. The general himself had one peculiarity, and that was a very correct knowledge of the topography of all places he had operated in or was about to operate in. He never forgot a house, a road, or a bayou. In fact, he seemed to possess all the crafts of a backwoodsman and never forgot a blazed tree. That's an amazingly supportive comment to make about anyone. During active operations or in preparation for them, Sherman was a man possessed, as Porter noticed. Quote, Sherman's whole mind was so absorbed in whatever work he had before him that he never thought of eating, sleeping, or his dress. The general's great delight was to pore over maps, and he seemed to take in all the roads, fields, and rivers as if they were good to eat and drink, or he would spend the night in writing out general orders, which were always very full and explicit. Porter thought that Sherman was, quote-unquote, the moving spirit of the Army. Now, throughout the Vicksburg Campaign, Porter noticed that he and Sherman agreed with each other time after time. They conceived problems similarly and they generated comparable solutions. And in fact, they had hit it off from very early on. They'd come to similar conclusions with regard to the war. After about 18 months of fighting, they had observed events and come to the same realization about what it would take to win the war. And so they began exchanging letters about this. They both agreed that the Union had to gain control of the Mississippi River and use it as a springboard for raids directed at the interior of the Confederacy. And that federal troops should eat the food, confiscate the slaves, destroy the railroads, and make life miserable for the Confederate population. Well, the possession of the river with an army capable of disembarking and striking inland would have a mighty influence, Sherman insisted to Porter. Porter responded very much similarly by using the words that whatever control I have on the river shall be exerted to help the army. I am of the opinion that there is but one way to make war, and that is to harass your enemy all you can. I have tried to be as unpleasant to the rebels on the river as possible, and hope that the new armies now going into the field will give them, specifically the rebels, a taste of devastation that may bring them to their senses. It's interesting how similar their attitudes are, and this is in late 1862, long before the war really takes on that kind of tone. In comparing Grant with Sherman, Porter marveled at their pronounced differences. I don't suppose there ever was a greater contrast between any two men than between Grant and Sherman. He, of course, described Grant as unimposing physically, but he was a congenial fellow with agreeable features, simple in taste and calm in demeanor. Sherman, however, was, quote, a hard weather-beaten soldier with a naturally corrugated face, a nervous, restless, active man. He thought that Grant resembled a private. Sherman looked, quote, very much a general, unquote. Porter once doubted that he ever held more than a 20-minute conversation with Grant. Probably no one ever did except Grant's wife, while Sherman gabbed incessantly. Grant chose good people and could delegate work, while Sherman, quote-unquote, attended to all the details himself. In fact, Porter thought that, quote, they were unlike in everything except in their skill as soldiers, yet they agreed perfectly. Think about what he's saying. He's got their relationship precisely right. That they're two very different individuals with wholly different skills, but they sort of had a similar idea about professionalism, and that brings them together. Porter's a very keen observer. He says that he concludes by saying, quote, Grant and Sherman together combine qualities possessed by no one general that ever lived. What one wants, the other possesses. Pretty observant fellow. Now, Porter shared these characteristics with both men. Temperamentally, he was more akin to Sherman, and he could act decisively, which was a quality that most observers affixed to Grant. Intellectually, Porter fit more comfortably with Sherman, and he certainly found Sherman's company more enjoyable and intimate. But there was something reassuring about Grant, that quiet confidence and serenity, soothing the more mercurial admiral. Similar to Grant and Sherman, Porter possessed a resourceful nature, and results, not methods, dominated his approach to military service in wartime. One time, after responding to a series of hypothetical questions from a young officer, Porter snarled back with his biting sarcasm, all I have to say to you is that when the time comes to use your judgment, you must use it. And if you do it right, you will hear from me damn quick. And if you do it wrong, you will hear from me a damn sight quicker. And that's very much Porter. Well, as a result of these things, each man came to believe in one another. After the failure of Deer Creek, it looked like they were going to have to try another assault, as you well know, of Chickasaw Bluffs. But then various strands came together in Grant's mind, and what he decided to do, of course, was march his troops along the west bank, down below the river, get Porter to run his gunboats below, and then shuttle them across the river and begin the campaign as it eventually happened. But for the new plan to work, Grant needed the Navy's support, so he communicated his plans with Porter. Will you be good enough, Admiral, to give this your early consideration and let me know your determination? Listen to what Grant's saying. He's asking Porter if he'll cooperate. He's not ordering him, he's not pressuring him, he's not playing politics. He's asking him if Porter will do it. And this is only a week after the Deer Creek disaster. Porter didn't hesitate. Quote, I am ready to cooperate with you in the matter of landing troops on the other side. But you must recollect that when these gunboats once go below, we give up all hopes of ever getting them up again because of the current of the Mississippi River. They've been moving so slowly in the face of the rebel batteries that they suffered too badly. And he also wanted to remind him that he went on to say that he was going to send his best gunboats down below, which meant if you decide you want to attack Haynes Bluff again, my best gunboats will be below the city and will be of no value to you. But if you want to incur that risk, then I'll do whatever you want. Anyway, Grant considered the issue and then decided the next day that he was going to try his new plan, and so that's exactly what they did. Neither Sherman nor Porter really believed in Grant's concept, but they both went along with it. They both indicated their uneasiness about it, Sherman in a long letter, Porter in person. But they both agreed to do whatever they could, and things turned out fine. As Porter said, so confident was I, this is what he wrote to the Secretary of the Navy, so confident was I of the ability of General Grant to carry out his plans when he explained them to me, that I never hesitated to change my position from above to below Vicksburg. That's an incredibly strong statement in support of a plan that you don't really believe in. What I'm telling you is that Porter believed in the man Grant rather than the plan that Grant proposed. And that took a lot of work on Grant's part. It took a lot of time. So Porter went about it. Grant accumulated the transports. Porter began stacking cotton bales and hay bales all around his gunboats to get everything all set. Then a problem emerged. Before they had finished the process, the Navy Department, or technically the Secretary of the Navy, cabled Porter, giving him a blistering rebuke for not doing other duties. He dismissed the worthwhileness of Porter's support for the project, claimed that the president was on board with the secretary and that what they really wanted Porter to be doing was patrolling the river between Vicksburg and Port Hudson. They said that, quote, this is of far greater importance than the flanking expeditions which thus far have prevented the consummation of this most desirable object. Well, I'm a big fan of Abraham Lincoln, but when it comes to this, their concept is preposterous. You know, they think that patrolling the river is really the key to stopping, to gaining control of the whole thing. And what they don't realize is, as Porter realizes, if you knock out Vicksburg, Port Hudson becomes untenable, then you control all up and down the river. Then all you have to do is patrol occasionally and block the mouths of all the major rivers pouring into the Mississippi River, and you've got the whole area. But it's really a pretty pathetic situation. But Porter, who never dodged a fight in his life, responded with clarity and force. Now, can you imagine this is an acting rear admiral writing back to the Secretary of the Navy? I'm sorry the department is not satisfied with the operations here, but you will please remember, sir, that I was ordered to cooperate with the Army, and sagacious officers deem these flanking movements of great importance. He then went on to say, quote, while it is my desire to carry out the wishes of the department in relation to all matters connected with operations here, still I must act in accordance with my judgment and a more full knowledge of affairs than the department could possibly have. Boy, that's a pretty stinging response, I think, by an officer to the Secretary of the Navy. The sad part is that Gideon Wells doesn't know what he's talking about. You know, he's a political hack and he's pretty foolish. And he of course detests Porter. And Porter's right. Porter's absolutely right. Nevertheless, Porter notified Grant that there was enormous political pressure on Porter to act immediately, and so what they're going to have to do is move out right away. The results or the consequence of what Lincoln and Wells did was they forced Porter to run the batteries at Vicksburg twice because they couldn't accumulate enough barges and they couldn't accumulate enough supplies to do it on a single trip. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out that you lose the element of surprise if you've done it once. Well, on the night of April 16, 7 gunboats and several transports with an assortment of steamers, coal barges, etc., which were lashed to the sides of these vessels, drifted quietly downriver. The Confederates, once they recognized them, began lighting up all sorts of, creating all sorts of prepared bonfires on various sides of the river to light up the river, and the Confederate batteries began opening up. At 11:16, the Confederates opened their fire on the lead vessel, the Benton, on which Porter sailed, and for 2.5 hours, the Vicksburg garrison poured shells on the convoy. Almost miraculously, only one craft was sunk, although all of them suffered pretty heavy losses. Just as the Benton emerged from the fire so that the fire could no longer reach them, a boat began rolling up, and he heard this voice yelling out, "Benton ahoy!" It was Sherman, of course. Sherman had to go out and visit Porter and see how everything turned out. So Sherman pulled alongside and began his usual needling. "You're more at home here than you were in the ditches grounding on willow trees. Stick to this, old fellow. It suits Jack better." That's typical Sherman. Then Sherman, of course, moving at 1,000,000 miles per hour, had to get back on his rowboat and check out all the transport vessels and all the gunboats as they came through to examine them. That was Sherman's way. Well, Porter then was supervising the loading of the vessels below the river, and he complained, quote, to Grant, "I wish 20 times a day that Sherman was here, or yourself, but I suppose we cannot have all we wish." He really wanted Sherman there because he believed, quote unquote, Sherman has more brains than all put together, unquote, talking about all the Army officers he knew. So he clearly was enormously impressed with Sherman. Grant, unfortunately, had other plans for Sherman. He led the feint on Haines Bluff while the Army was being shoveled across the river. During the actual campaign, Porter had to sail down to the mouth of the Red River, where the Red River intersects the Mississippi River, take over some duties with Farragut, and then return back upriver, arriving around the 18th of May. And at that point, when he came up back up to the area. He was just in time to encounter Sherman on the bluffs. And so he began communicating with Sherman and then opened up the cracker line. In addition, for the 2 assaults on the 19th and 22nd of May against the Vicksburg garrison, the gunboats were used and mortar bolts were used to lob shells on the Confederate position. In one instance, on the 27th of May, Sherman requested a gunboat attack a water battery that anchored the rebel left flank, and so Porter ordered the vessel Cincinnati to close in on the target and fire on it. Well, the Confederate gunners turned around, and with a few well-aimed shots, they sank Cincinnati. Cincinnati was struck and sank in the course of just a few minutes. Sherman felt horrible. 40 men were killed. He felt it was terrible. And when he went to apologize to Porter, Porter said, "Oh, you know, it's unfortunate, but that's what war is all about. These things happen." If you were in the Navy today and you lost your boat, you would be in unbelievable trouble. I mean, you'd never see the light of day. You'd be in the brig for the rest of your life. Porter just blew it off. Thought, you know, that's what war is all about. These things happen. And in fact, that was true. Back in December, one of his gunboat commanders was trying to move in along the Yazoo River to get in a great position to bombard the Confederate works, and hit a mine, and his vessel sunk. And so, and the commander was one of the best that Porter had. So when he asked Porter about the date of the court of inquiry, Porter exploded. "Court? I have no time to order courts. I can't blame an officer who seeks to put his ship close to the enemy." And then Porter just got back on his vessel and chugged away. He wasn't going to hold any of that nonsense. You're doing your duty. You're trying to fulfill your mission. You do it the best way you can. And if something disastrous happens, that's just reality. That's just life. But at least you lose it in an attempt to be aggressive, in an attempt to fulfill your mission. Well, when Vicksburg fell on the 4th of July, Grant and Porter gathered briefly for some warm congratulations. And 2 days later, in the after-action report, Grant claimed Porter's aid. He expressed, quote, "thankfulness for my good fortune in being placed in cooperation with an officer of the Navy such as Porter. The Admiral and his subordinates, quote, have ever shown the greatest readiness in their cooperation, no matter what was to be done or what risk to be taken, either by their men or their vessels." Grant then concluded that, quote, "without this prompt and cordial support, my movements would have been much embarrassed, if not wholly defeated." Sherman, too, heaped praise on the Admiral. He wrote him as soon as he learned Sherman had been pushed on to the Big Black River in case Johnston attacked him, so Sherman wasn't over in the Vicksburg area. In so magnificent a result, I stopped not to count who did it. It is done, and the day of our nation's birth is consecrated and baptized anew in a victory won by the united Navy and Army of our country. God grant that the harmony and mutual respect that exists between our respective commanders and shared by all true men of the joint service may continue forever and serve to elevate our national character threatened with shipwreck. From a more personal standpoint, Sherman admitted that whether success attend my efforts or not, I know that Admiral Porter will ever accord to me the exhibition of a pure and unselfish zeal in the service of our country, unquote. Later on, a few days later, Sherman and his staff were drinking in Jackson and toasting the Navy's performance and singing choruses of Army and Navy forever. And the day after that, Sherman pledged his eternal support for Porter. "To me, it will ever be a source of pride that real harmony has always characterized our intercourse, and what may arise, I will ever call upon Admiral Porter with the same confidence as I have in the past." Porter, too, accorded full credit for the Vicksburg Campaign to Grant, and he said so in his report to the Secretary of the Navy, stating, quote, "The late investment and capture of Vicksburg will be characterized as one of the greatest military achievements ever known. The conception of the idea originated solely with General Grant, who adopted a course in which great labor was performed, great battles were fought, and great risks were run. A single mistake would have involved us in difficulty, but so well were all the plans matured, so well were all the movements timed, and so rapid were the evolutions performed, that not a mistake has occurred from the passage of the fleet by Vicksburg and the passage of the army across the river up to the present time. Those are pretty glowing words from each group. It's a strange thing what happened there. The Vicksburg juggernaut brought together Grant, Sherman, Porter, and really bonded them. Grant and Sherman already had a strong bond, but really the Vicksburg Campaign brought them together as nothing had before. And Porter, too, now was joined in. So instead of the duo, they now had a triumvirate. And the reality is that they developed lifelong friendships as a result of their performance here at Vicksburg. Sherman and Porter never campaigned again together, but they continued to correspond. Throughout the course of the war, they would write long, chatty letters to one another, discuss personnel, discuss plans, try and hammer out different problems. They worked really well together. Grant and Porter had one more battle to fight. Actually, it was a campaign for Fort Fisher. The first time Porter went out with Benjamin Butler, and the whole thing was a fiasco. If you know anything about Benjamin Butler, you know why, and I won't elaborate. But the second time they went out, they replaced Butler with Alfred Terry, and this time Grant made it explicitly clear. He told Terry in his instructions that you listen to what Porter tells you to do, and everything will work out fine. And in fact, the situation did work out fine. The Federals were able to capture Fort Fisher, and it was quite an achievement. During the post-war years, of course, the three of them retained strong relationships. Porter became the ranking naval officer several years afterwards. When Grant was president, Grant wanted him to be Secretary of the Navy, but Porter refused because he had reached the pinnacle of his career, being the chief naval officer. Grant, of course, rose to be the commanding general of the United States Army. So the three of them retained that really strong relationship. Late in life, Grant wrote, "Among naval officers, I've always placed Porter in the highest rank. I believe Porter to be to be as great an admiral as Lord Nelson." Sherman's pet name for Porter was Lord High Admiral of the U.S. Navy. Of course, Grant died first of the three, and then several years later, Porter and Sherman died one day apart. Sort of interesting, and to those three individuals whose lives came together for this Vicksburg campaign. So, I'm a few minutes over, but we started late. Nevertheless, anybody have any questions? I'll be glad to answer them. Yes?
This experience with Sherman and Porter, was this a model for naval Army operations, i.e. in Normandy, North Africa, and the Mediterranean? Was this ever, in a war college, ever a model?
No. And that's sort of a sad situation with regard to these episodes. It's only recently that they came to that realization. If you've ever read Omar Bradley's autobiography, it's a pretty shocking experience in the sense that Bradley says things like, you know, there wasn't anybody to study from with regard to Army group commands, so I had to look at the Brits and so on. Well, you know, we had Army group commanders in the Civil War. That's what Sherman was. The problem was that a lot of these guys had never studied these matters, and they would have saved themselves enormous amounts of headaches by doing that sort of homework. So while some of them tended to be pretty well read in military history in World War II, not that many of them were. I'm becoming more and more convinced that not that many of them were. Some were. I think Eisenhower was better read. I know Patton was better read. And I certainly know MacArthur was better read. But whether they studied the relationship between Grant and Porter, I doubt it. I'll bet they didn't spend much time at it at all. The Navy was really an inferior service back in the Civil War days. It was really regarded as such. Well, look in this room. How many people have delved into the Navy ORs? You know, just a few people probably. That's not very many. But they're fabulous books. I mean, there's even there's Grant correspondence, Sherman correspondence, Lincoln correspondence, things you wouldn't see in the OR, in the Navy OR. But very few people even look at it. The OR is the official records of the rebellion, in case you're interested.
Joe, when you were at Carlisle, obviously, there was something that stimulated you to go into this type of investigation. Was there a lot of discussion in the War College about these types of relationships? Obviously, there was a lot of move toward jointness and operations. How did you happen across selecting these three individuals?
What happened was, I wanted to teach a course, an elective course, that would be very useful to the students. I was very concerned, you know, it's a course, it's a program for people of colonel rank or comparable, captains in the Navy, or colonel in the Army or the Air Force and the Marine Corps. And so, and you train people on to think on the strategic and high operational levels. So I wanted to develop a course that would be useful. When I talked to Jay Luvas, he thought of studying command relationships in the Civil War would work. And so I was looking for episodes that would demonstrate that joint situation. That's why, we had classes, one of which was on Grant Sherman Porter. We had another one on Butler Porter and Terry Porter, so that we would have two classes that would be beneficial to Navy officers and obviously Air Force officers, although not quite to the same degree, but certainly to a fair degree. And that's where I came up with those.
And as a follow-on question to that, Rowena Reed had apparently achieved some sponsorship with the Naval Institute Press in her, heavens, now help me out.
This is Herman's favorite book, as I recall. Let me check this out with you, Herman. Isn't the opening line to that review, "This book need never have been written"?
Is that
what you wrote? Something pretty close to that?
Well, expand on that.
Go ahead, Herman. You wrote the review.
Well, I wasn't expecting this. The thing about Rowena Reed's book is that the thesis goes somewhat counter to some fundamental things that Arthur Jones and I wanted to say, and it was asserted out North One. And so it fell my lot to review that book. While we were working on How North One, I kind of had to take some shots at it, and did.
I don't remember the book, frankly, very well, but my recollection is that it was just off. It just didn't.
Well, the reason I asked the question was when I was working on master's thesis, my thesis advisor had highly recommended reading. Of course, he was trying to steer us into more naval studies, but and I have to admit that when I read the thing, I didn't read a whole lot of other comparison. I read it because he told me to read it, and so I didn't have much of a basis of comparison. But I found it interesting that the Navy chose to publish the thing. Is there any speculation as to why that might have happened?
Lack of studies in the field. Welcome to them. I think that more than anything else. I doubt that they truly studied in meticulous detail what she said. They were just so glad she was saying anything.
We were talking about that this evening.
I now remember another tidbit about that I think is sort of amusing. She did subsequently write a review of How North One, and you can guess what it was. It was 98% scathing negative commentary, but 2% she said something nice, and the University of Illinois Press excerpted that and quoted it in the advertisement.
We were talking about this at dinner. There's virtually nothing written on the Navy, or there's just the amount that's been written is very limited. A guy like Porter.
There's a vacuum there in scholarship. There's room for the young scholar who would like to find something that hasn't been ultimately and actually done.
Well, there's that recent book by our friend Dudley Cornish and Virginia Lass. Yeah, but that's about it. I mean, we've had some blockade running and blockading studies, But really, I can't think of anything recently. A guy like Porter, as viewed by a modern military individual, could be a wonderful volume. Because one thing you realize, I think, when you study guys like Grant, Sherman, and Porter, is that what they do is timeless. The way they think is timeless. The progressive nature. I mean, it's just out of this world. Remember the Grenada operation, where they had to send credit card calls back to Fort Bragg to communicate to the Navy vessels to redirect gunfire because they couldn't communicate from shore to ship. But in the Civil War at Fort Fisher, when Terry was there, they sent a Navy guy down with Terry in the invasion force. So they had a wigwag system which could communicate instantly with the ships. And so what you were doing is having Terry directing naval gunfire from the ground, from the scene. I mean, 20 years later, we still couldn't get this concept down, but they could do it in 1865. I mean, God, if somebody just studied this sort of thing, and we would talk to the professional soldiers and sailors and so on, these people were amazed at how knowledgeable, how professional they were. They'd read Sherman's orders and they'd say, you know, we don't have a person in the Army today who could write an order this good. Or they'd say, look at how progressive Porter is. Look at the issues that they're tackling. Because there are certain issues that are universal with military forces, especially in situations like joint operations. And these people are wrestling with them and overcoming them, despite an incredible dearth of technology by our standards.
You know, it may well be that the market isn't really there for that kind of stuff. It's not necessarily so much that no scholar does it, but that those few who do don't reap rewards. I'm thinking now, for example, of the works of Norman Delaney, a biography of John McIntosh Kell, the executive officer of the Alabama.
Yeah. But on the other hand, I'll bet a book on Farragut would sell, biography of Farragut, or of large figures, probably sell.
Well,
Certainly a book on Semmes, a biography of Semmes or something would sell. Yes?
well, going back to Deer Creek, how far could those gunboats maneuver? You said they got through Rolling Fork and above in Deer Creek. Is that what you said?
No, they hadn't gotten to Rolling Fork. They were in Deer Creek. My recollection. I'll check it out for you. But that's my recollection.
And my second question is, what did they do? Back those boats out of Deer Creek?
They did back them out.
Yes,
right.
that's exactly what they did do.
How did they do that? Just put it in the river?
Yeah.
They didn't use views and stuff to drag it out like the Erie Canal, huh? They did? You say they did not get as far as Rolling Fork?
That's my recollection. Okay, no, as I recall, they were on the verge of breaking out. Let's see. Here are my notes, but I was hoping that I have some distance. Yeah, all I have is that they worked their way along Deer Creek, closing in on Rolling Fork, and when they hit Rolling Fork, they had more open space. So they were pretty close.
Yeah, the mouth is up north of Rolling Fork.
Yeah.
So they would have gotten into a wider
Yeah.
channel there.
I mean, it's a really amazing thing. I haven't been up there, but I've talked to people who have, and they tell me it's incredibly small, incredibly narrow.
It's like a little ditch,
I'm
huh?
supposed to go up there in April to go kind of mucking around up there, and I can't wait. Can't wait to see.
hard to get a job though, that's Deer Creek now.
Yeah, I hear it's a little more narrow. I mean, how wide is it?
Deer Creek?
Yeah.
About half as wide as this one. Wide at some points and very, very narrow, especially in that area you're talking about south of Rolling Fork, just a ditch almost.
Yeah. Well, actually, when you read the quotations from from Porter and Sherman, they both describe it as like a ditch. You know, both of them use that exact word, ditch.
But when you keep talking about Deer Creek, I'm wondering if you talk about some other body of water.
No.
I can imagine.
No, it's unbelievable.
Deer Creek.
Now, they did, I mean, I'm sure that they tried to flood the area, but...
It was heavily flooded.
You gotta
Yes, it was,
remember the high
that's right, it
water.
was the, you know, well, it was this time of year, actually. Well, yeah, another month from now, which would be ideal, high water time. But still, that's a pretty amazing thing.
How did Grant manage to keep Farragut out of this equation as a player? Obviously, there had to have been some professional jealousy between Farragut and Porter. I think you mentioned in your book once or twice. There is some relationship, and then somehow Farragut just backs out of the picture. Does Grant influence that?
No, it has to do with the assignments. That is, that Porter's assigned to the, you know, the Mississippi River Squadron, and that Farragut is assigned to the Gulf area, which includes a certain distance of the Mississippi River, but it was clearly in Porter's domain. I think in having done a lot of background readings, people tend to, there's a competitiveness between Porter and Farragut, and frankly, Porter's a better officer. Porter's a more progressive thinker. If I had to have one to fit into today's Navy, Porter would fit in more rapidly than would Farragut. But Porter's got problems. You know, his big mouth is a real problem. As far as a military mind, but Porter's got the greater military mind. But they were, you know, they were foster brothers. While there's a competition, it's not a real hostile relationship at all. I remember after Farragut died, people were trying to claim that Porter was, you know, was angling for the job and so on, had been doing so for a long time to be the, you know, the commander of the Navy. And Porter said, you know, that's just nonsense, because the only way I was going to get that job was if David died, and I didn't want to see David die. He knew he wasn't going to retire. So, and I think Porter was telling the truth. I think it's more like a sibling rivalry, but you don't want to see bad things happen to your brother. Yes?
I have an opinion question, if I could.
I don't have opinions.
Is there an equivalent Confederate team? Lee and Jackson come to mind, who were as good, perhaps better, given equal resources, or?
Lee and Jackson have a great relationship, but the thing I've found so interesting in study of command relationships is that they're all so different. It's like friendships. Friendships work for different reasons for different individuals, and so it is with military. In Lee and Jackson, I see two men with similar approaches to warfare, but Lee's a great planner, and Jackson's a great executor. Whereas Grant, Sherman, and Porter, you're dealing with more of a partnership. You've got people with very different areas of ability coming together and treating one another as equals. Jackson and Lee were never equals. Lee was always in charge. There was no doubt in anyone's mind who was in charge. And I think, and while I have great admiration for Jackson, Lee has a great mind. Jackson doesn't have a great mind. That's my sense of it anyway. I'm not saying that I don't mean to put down Jackson, because Jackson's a wonderful soldier, and he's really grasped the essence of warfare. But he's not a brilliant thinker. He's got a good mind, but he's not a brilliant man. Grant is not a brilliant man, but he's to my mind, when it comes to military affairs, he's got a better mind than Jackson, because he's been forced to think on Grant's scheme. And Sherman and Porter obviously have great minds. They're more like Lee. Does that make any sense to everybody? the bottom line is that command relationships are all different. And of the Confederate ones, the Lee-Jackson one is the one that works best at the high level. Yes?
I was going to ask you about that same question, but I was going to ask you what trio in the West with the Southern trio in the West with the third person as a naval officer, the Southerners. Was there ever any trio like that you could even put a handle on?
No. But the Confederates are in a weak position with regard to the Navy. Well, remember, the best known naval officer for the Confederacy is Semmes, and he commands one ship.
Well, my next question was going to be, why didn't the Southerners get more of the naval operations out of New Orleans and up and down Mississippi like they did in Virginia and Norfolk?
Well, the big thing is that, of course, the Navy goes with the Union. And so the Union's got an incredible advantage. Plus, the Union has enormous industrial capacity. And the Confederacy has, the South was not a shipbuilding region. And so that wasn't one of their fortes. What they did with the Merrimack is, of course, raise it back up, repair it, and put iron plating over it. And they did try, the Arkansas on the Mississippi River that they built, which was a holy terror for a short period of time. And they tried other endeavors like that. But it's just so hard. And one ship, of course, is not going to sustain you for the long haul. I wish I had some statistics here off the top of my head, but by the end of the war, the Union has the finest Navy in the world. And I think that's really clear. That's why one of the issues that people raise is, if the British got involved in the war, well, the British got their asses kicked in the Crimea. What makes you think that they're going to have some revolutionary impact on the Civil War? The Crimea is a heck of a lot closer than the American South. And one of the big problems you have in the American South is, say, deterioration of railroads. Were they going to ship rails from England? I don't think so. And of course, then they'd have to confront the United States Navy, which was an exceedingly formidable force. So I think it's probably easy to overrate what impact the British would have had. Yes?
Joe, if you run across in your research, they imply that the Confederate governor made a decision not to emphasize the Navy initially because they were counting on the British Navy to help them keep at least the sea lanes open. Jack Davis kind of hints at that in your book.
Who does?
Jack Davis.
Huh. I don't know. Do you know anything, Herman?
I don't know about how to document or underpin this, but empirically, it's very plausible. And I would add to that, I was thinking, as we were talking, I think the conscious decision was made in the Confederacy to go with what I would call kinkiness, weird new stuff, submarines ultimately, and Davis before that, and the hope that somehow they could come up with stuff that was new and different and potent enough to be the turning point. Because they knew they were the weaker, and of course, as time passed, they were ever more the weaker.
Yeah. But you're right, you couldn't, I wouldn't be surprised if the North was the largest shipbuilder in the world at the time the war broke out, or if not, could be readily made so. And the Confederacy never would have been able to compete with the North. And actually, it makes kind of good sense. If you can't deal with the enemy's resources or manpower, then you've got to find some alternatives to offset those resources.
And really, they came close. That adds to the tantalizing interest of it all. It was just too little too late, but they really came close.
That's right. Well, you look at, for example, they've devoted a lot of attention to what they call torpedoes. We would call them land mines. And Sherman's army suffered quite a few losses in advancing down towards Savannah with those things. Can you imagine if the Confederacy mass-produced them and, for example, laid them out in front of their trenches at Petersburg? You would have virtually nullified the Union Army's ability to pass through that region. People were horrified of those things. In fact, what Sherman did was he made Confederate troops march ahead of his troops on the road so that they'd get blown up instead of his own men. And Sherman, strangely enough, thought that they were unethical, inhumane. It's true. Sherman did think that.
The earlier relationship, Grant obviously has previous experience with a limited combined operations, or at least cooperative operations, when he moves against Henry and against Donaldson. Do you have any other information? What type of relationship did Grant have with Andrew Foote and with the Navy in his early operations?
My sense is he has a pretty good relationship with Foote, but the Navy is... Foote's an older man, and while Porter's older than Grant and Sherman, you don't have a big age difference, and you don't have the really significant distinction. And I think that that's probably a big factor. In other words, I think that Grant and Foote get along fine, and they work pretty well together in the circumstances, but there's just not that sort of magical relationship that they have with Porter.
So
and of course, Foote doesn't live that long.
So there's no sensation that you get that Grant did not necessarily intuitively deduct that the Navy was an important component of any of his operations. You think it perhaps was more personality driven?
I think Grant probably kind of stumbled his way through Donaldson a little bit. That's probably a bad word, stumble, but he's learning his way as he goes through. And by the time he gets to Vicksburg, he has a better understanding of or appreciation of the gunboats and so on. But remember, Porter's got those turtles, which are ironclad gunboats, so they're much more resistant. They can endure a heck of a lot more than what Porter's got. Remember, Porter's guns get driven back pretty easily by the Fort Donaldson battery.
Another question?
Yeah. Anything?
You know, one of the comments you made about the Sherman being able to remember topographical features, that same point was made by Horace Porter when he was talking about Grant, was that Grant seemed to be able to instantly visualize terrain features.
From a map, though.
From a map, yeah. And then once he looked at them, so...
when I was doing this, we also had a class on Grant, Meade, and some other things. And it's interesting because Grant would say things, he'd write messages to Meade. I think if you do this, you'll find that such and such will happen. And Meade will write back, I don't see it, I don't see it. And Grant would say, look, here's where it is. And Meade would go to the ground and he'd say, you're right. And Meade was a topographical engineer. So Grant had a good sense in that way, but I don't think Grant's like Sherman. Sherman's got the better. Sherman is notorious for his grasp or recollection of regions. He's just amazingly good at it.
It much affects his conduct of the Georgia campaign. He, earlier in his career, had gone over that terrain. I think you pointed that out.
Yeah. Yeah. So he had traveled in the region, but that was 22 years earlier. Still, he remembered it well enough from 22 years ago that he was able to get his way through. And remember, we're not talking about follow Interstate 10 or something like that. I mean, we're talking about country roads and hills, and he's concerned about, you know, mountains, topography, crops that are grown in regions, river crossings, depths of rivers, just all sorts of issues like that.